Today we are going to talk about International Day of Migrants and International Human Rights Day. Now, both International Human Rights Day and International Migrants Day, it is celebrated in the month of December. The first International Human Rights Day is celebrated on 10th of December, whereas International Migrant Day is celebrated on 18th. It is not a coincidence that both the days are celebrated in the same month. It is basically about talking about the rights at different levels. Hence, they are celebrated in the similar month. The International Day of Human Rights, according to United Nations, it basically commemorates the adoption of Human Rights Declaration, which was passed by United Nations in the year of 1948. Like this day is basically dedicated to promote the rights and freedom of everyone. And when we're talking about rights and freedom of everyone, then definitely we're talking about Mr. Faizaan with us, who is a researcher, a doctoral candidate, and a teacher at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And he will speak on the topic of people on the move to highlight various kinds of injustices and inequalities.
तो मैं डॉक्टर साइमा का शुक्रिया अदा करना चाहता हूँ जिन्होंने मुझे यहाँ आप सबसे बात करने के लिए दावत दी और आप सबका भी शुक्रिया अदा करना चाहता हूँ कि तो खैर the topic we have for today is people on the move in conjunction with World Migration Day and also with World Human Rights Day. I think this topic is supremely important. I also think this topic is very important for the new program that you all are related to or linked with or directly part of. Before we begin, let me just give a brief introduction of myself. I'm Faizaan Qayyum. I teach urban planning here at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. I am father to a 3-year-old monster. You can see her in the picture. She now defines the entire scope of my existence as it stands. Anyhow, I'm a doctoral candidate at UIUC. I teach undergraduate students here. My research interests are in violence, displacement, local governance. My field is urban planning. I do realize you've been talking to a lot of urban planners, it seems, but hopefully this is going to be useful for you all. I've also been trained in economics, and as of now, I have 7 years and counting of continuous ongoing research in policy advocacy in Quetta, Pakistan, where I do a lot of my research. Today, we're going to start with prehistoric movements. The world as it exists today is defined, made by people moving from one place to another. This is not a recent phenomenon. This has been going on since times immemorial. So yes, we're going to look over prehistoric movements. We're going to very quickly cover pre-colonial movements and then look at colonial movements and how that changed things substantially. Then we're going to try and link globalization and modern movements with how we see the world today. That is going to take us to some very important classifications. Why do people move? Some movements are voluntary. Some movements are involuntary. Sometimes people are forced to move. We're going to go into that in a little detail, and we're going to look at some classifications and definitions that international law uses. And then I'm going to very briefly touch upon some fundamental contradictions in this entire model. With that, let's start with prehistoric movements. The modern human being, Homo sapiens, came from a single female ancestor in Northeast Africa, in Ethiopia. The world, 8 billion or 9 billion people today, did not just magically populate itself. From that single female ancestor, the population grew and people started to move out. Primarily, these movements for survival. The first prehistoric societies were hunter-gatherer societies. They couldn't grow crops. They didn't have a way to settle down and cultivate food for themselves. So they had to continuously move around just to find new food sources and to survive. And at the same time, temperatures and the global climate was changing alongside. So this was a movement for survival in multiple waves. From Africa, the people moved into Europe, into Asia, into North America, and into South America. And along the way, the Homo sapiens, modern human beings, interacted and often interbred with other species that closely resemble the modern human being, but they're not exactly the modern human being. So they're being interbred with the Neanderthals in Europe, with the Denisovans in Asia. At some point, human beings figured out that they could actually grow crops and they could cultivate the land. This created the incentive to settle down and led to the emergence of the earliest human settlements. So this is just a very brief, a very reductionist kind of view on prehistoric movements of human beings. There is a map online. If you Google Human Odyssey map, that is a fascinating resource to look at these movements. We come to colonial times. Something drastically changed along the ways at some point. The Europeans figured out how to make their ships work. Colonial violence, right? They started capturing places. They started killing off native populations, sometimes through warfare and more often through disease. They started capturing natives and they started shipping them off as slaves. This sheds light on forced migrations even today. And all of this, by the way, happened in the name of the king of Spain, or the king of the Great Britain, or the king of the Netherlands, or whatever the case was, and in the name of the Christ. So, come today in 2020, we had 281 million migrants that constituted 3.6% of the world's population. Now, when you say there were 281 million migrants, we're only talking of people who were born abroad in a different place from where they currently live. Now, if my daughter was born here in the United States, she is, by this definition, not a migrant. However, the people of this city, of this country, will always see her as an immigrant, if she chooses to settle here, that is. So there are differences between how we legally define a migrant and how we socially define a migrant. And that is something that we have to keep in mind, especially if you're thinking about human rights and if you're thinking about justice. So this begs the question of why people move in the first place, right? We saw that the British and other European powers were moving slaves from Africa to other parts of the world. That was involuntary movement. It was forceful displacement. But at the same time, if you go back to this figure, 281 million migrants, a lot of those people moved by choice. People move for better education. I moved to the US to get a PhD here. And now I teach here, right? So people move for educational opportunities, people move for economic opportunities, people move to flee war or other physical threats, right? So some of these movements are voluntary and some of these movements are involuntary. And this is where the kind of the part two of our talk today takes us to some of these key definitions that help, differentiate between different types of movements. The first important definition is a migrant. Now, there is no ironclad legal definition of a migrant. So I'm just going to take a very generic kind of term and see, try to use that just to explain what it means. So a migrant is someone who moves from one country to another. It's a very general, very generic term. Some people are regular migrants because they have legal permission to move from their country and to move to the country that they're in. Other people are irregular migrants. By irregular, we mean they do not have legal permission either to move out of their country or to move into this new country that they're now in. Generally, we use migrants to talk about people who've moved voluntarily. We don't use the term migrant to talk about people who've moved involuntarily. Right? For people who move involuntarily, we have a different set of definitions. Right? The first term I want to introduce you to is refugee. This is especially pertinent in our context, especially these days, as we try to move hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people out of the country by force. So anyway, what is a refugee? What do we mean when we say refugee? So I'm going to read out the UN High Commission for Refugees definition for a refugee. A refugee is someone who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. A refugee has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Most likely, they cannot return home or are afraid to do so. War and ethnic, tribal, and religious violence are leading causes of refugees fleeing their countries. So this is the UNHCR definition of a refugee, right? So we have a bunch of key characteristics of what constitutes a refugee. One, they're forced to flee. Two, they have a well-founded fear of identity-linked persecution. And three, they cannot return or they are afraid to return because of this fear of violence and persecution, right? Now, when you're a refugee, you get legal protections under international law, which much of the developed world ignores at will and adopts at will, as we have seen, especially in more recent events in Palestine, for example. Now, another key term that I want you to think about is asylum seeker. An asylum seeker is somebody who has left their country. They have applied for refuge in a different country from their country of origin, but they haven't yet been recognized legally as a refugee. Now, if we bring this home to Pakistan, there are many Afghans in Pakistan that have applied for asylum. Either, I'm not sure if people apply for asylum in Pakistan, but there are several who have applied for asylum, for example, in the UK or in the US. And they are waiting for these external governments to decide on their petitions for refuge. And in the meantime, they're just trying to keep themselves safe in Pakistan. They're not legally recognized as refugees in Pakistan. So just to kind of make this relevant for our own context here, right? But this is a very brief timeline of international law and international institutions around the issue of refugees and forceful displacement. In 1921, the first High Commissioner for Refugees was appointed. This was after World War One, and this was as Europe, after fighting itself for several years, was trying to deal with problems of displaced people and stateless people. In 1922, they introduced the first passport for stateless Europeans. It was called the Nansen passport. This allowed the High Commissioner for Refugees to give documentation to people who had become stateless, who had been kicked out of their countries, and allow them to travel and allow them to resettle in places out of their home countries. 1945, the Second World War ends, and the International Refugee Organization helps over 1 million people resettle in other countries. Right? So 1945 also came with the brutal murder and genocide of Jewish people in Europe. And after the war ended, Europe just one day decided to resettle them in the colonial territory of what used to be Palestine. This also just kind of helps make it relevant for today. Interestingly, in resettling the Jewish people in Palestine, they used a legal principle of right to return, because the Jewish people had in ancient times been forcefully displaced from their lands around Jerusalem and what is today Palestine. So they argued that they had the right to return to their hometowns in what was then Palestine. So anyway, the IRO helps resettle over 1 million people. In 1948, after the Second World War, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is passed, and it includes the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. And in 1950, the UNHCR was set up as a kind of to follow the International Refugee Organization. The UNHCR was set up to deal with continuing problems of displacement in Europe. The UN High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR, followed the IRO. It had a 3-year mandate. It was supposed to function for 3 years, and then it was supposed to kind of get disbanded, and everybody was just supposed to get back to work. The primary aim for the UNHCR was to help displaced Europeans find a place of refuge and to get resettled. The 1951 Refugee Convention, which is the first kind of legal convention adopted by countries of the world, limited the UNHCR's focus to events in Europe and displaced people in Europe from Europe. So we have something noticeable here is that the UNHCR had very particular, racially, I would say, defined point of origin as well as function, right? This stayed until 1967. It took them 16 years. And around the same time, remember that, the British are leaving South Asia, so India, Pakistan are coming into being. There's millions of people being uprooted from India and from Pakistan, and they're moving from one country to another. And the UNHCR has no legal mandate to play here. They're solely focused on Europe. In 1967, the Refugee Convention of 1951 was amended. And this amendment, which is called the 1967 Protocol, it removed the geographic and time-based restrictions that limited the UNHCR to Europe. And it universalized protection to displaced people around the world. Now, the question then becomes, what are some of the rights that the UNHCR now recognizes that it expects the world to recognize? One of the most critical rights is to seek asylum, which has been recognized in the Declaration of Human Rights. So it is now a basic human right to seek asylum in countries outside of one's own if one fears persecution in their own country. A second principle, which is extremely important, is no refoulement. An asylum seeker cannot be sent back to their home country or to a third country where they may be at risk of violence or persecution. And the UNHCR expects everybody to respect those rights and to observe them. But how is this played out, really, in the world? In this year, the world crossed 100 million displaced people. Less than 35% of those are legally recognized as refugees. Right? Now think of this in terms of Pakistan, right? So we have Afghan people who live in the country. We have Bengali people who live in the country. We have Bihari people who live in the country. And we have people of African origin who live in the country. Right? We only recognize a very small part of Afghans as legal refugees. Everybody else is not recognized as a refugee and does not get those legal protections. They do not get the right to work. They do not get the protection from refoulement. They do not get other legal protections. They do not get protection from being forcefully sent back, from forceful repatriation. Because the only people eligible legally for these protections are people that we have formally recognized as refugees. And in the interim, occasionally, we extend those rights to asylum seekers while their petitions for refuge are being decided. So the numbers are pretty consistent, right? The number of actual refugees in Pakistan are just a fraction of how many people actually live in the country, how many people have actually sought refuge, even without the legal cover of this term of being a refugee in the country. Around the world, around 60% of displaced people live in cities. So the era of refugee camps is over pretty much. Right? So once upon a time, the world thought that it was a good idea to put people in camps to shut them off, keep them insulated from the local population. And the camp was also for UNHCR a good way to manage relief goods, right? So if you want to distribute food, you can't go around finding refugees all across the city if they're spread out. It's easier if you just kind of bunch them all into a camp and just, throw food at them if you want. And I say this in a very derogatory way because this is literally how they used to do it. And this is also how, unfortunately, many of us would like us to do it. But the UNHCR now recognizes that that is not the way to go. And people, if they're displaced from their home countries and they're moving to a different place, cities allow them to chance to contribute meaningfully to the economy, to contribute meaningfully socially, to make a living for themselves, to not be a burden on global agencies like the UNHCR or on the local governments. So now the UNHCR encourages urban refugees. If you do have a refugee situation, they want those refugees to get the right to work and to be able to live in cities with some form of assistance, of course, from the UNHCR or from other agencies. Another important point worth noting also is most of the world's forcefully displaced people are in the global south. They move from one vulnerable context to another. And yet all of the hullabaloo you hear about refugees comes from Europe. Right? You have these insane right-wing governments in Europe trying to ban migration, and I include the UK now when I talk of Europe, right? Even though the fact is they've only ever taken a fraction of the world's displaced population. Much of the world's displaced population lives in countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh and Turkey more recently. And Germany's numbers have come up in recent years, especially since the Ukraine war broke out. But that is again because they're okay with white Ukrainian refugees coming in, not so much with Afghan refugees coming in, or not so much with Syrian refugees coming in. And we're going to go into a little more detail about that too. So When I say most of the world's refugees live in the global south, 69% of people displaced went to neighboring countries. When the Rohingyas were displaced from Burma, they went to Bangladesh, which was a neighboring country. When the Afghans were displaced from Afghanistan, they came to Pakistan. A lot of them went to Iran. Some of them went to the Central Asian countries around them. A small fraction of them also ended up in India somehow. But 69% of the world's refugees live in neighboring countries. 75% of the world's refugees live in low and middle income countries. So it is not the US and the UK and Germany and Switzerland and France and all of these other xenophobic countries, honestly, that host most of the world's refugees. It is countries like Pakistan, like Bangladesh, that host most of the world's refugees. 20% of the world's refugees were in the poorest or the least developed countries, right? So a fifth of the world's refugee population lives in countries that already do not have enough for their own people. And yet they're able to host millions of people. Out of, if let's say, if the estimated displaced population is 100 million, that means 20 million people live in the least developed, the poorest countries of the world. So who becomes a refugee, right? Who are these people who move in, right? So the most marginalized, the most vulnerable, and the most horribly persecuted people are forced to flee. Fleeing one's home is not a luxury. It is not an easy choice. It is not something you just want to get up and do, no matter what some people would have us believe, right? The journeys themselves are long, treacherous, and extremely risky. There is no guarantee that people would make it out alive. Many people don't make it out alive. And where do these people end up? Like I just pointed out, 69% end up in a neighboring country, 70% end up within the developing world in a lower middle income country, right? Very few people actually end up in better circumstances. Most people, what it means is they escape one violent context, one kind of violence, and they land in a different kind of violent context. The people who fled violence in Afghanistan landed in places like Quetta that have for years, for decades now, borne the brunt of terrorism and all kinds of sectarian and other targeted violence, right? So think of Afghan Hazara refugees who moved from Afghanistan and came to Quetta, right? So there they were targeted by the Taliban, they were targeted by majoritarian tribes and ethnicities. Here they were targeted by sectarian militants. Right? So they fled one violent context, landed in another violent context, right? And even when people do reach countries in Europe or countries like the UK or Australia, they face racism, they face discrimination, they face violence, they face economic hardship. Not just once they settle there, they face racism even in trying to escape these violent settings. And many people simply end up in the sea on the way. We are reminded at this point of the multiple boat disasters that have taken place near Europe, where hundreds of Pakistanis have lost their lives, including national athletes who were the minority Hazara community from Quetta. Right? So these are people with national recognition, but they're so violently targeted that they had no choice but to flee. And despite this recognition of the right to seek asylum in a different country that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights gives, the Western world was unwilling to give them a safe route to seek asylum. They had to get on a boat, which often sinks. The journey itself is horrible. It's not a fun journey, even if you make it alive. They don't have enough life jackets. Many people are forced to kind of stay under the deck. They don't see the sky for days. They don't get fresh air to breathe for days. And when the boat starts to, be at physical risk, the most marginalized are the first to be thrown off to save the boat. These journeys are hard, right? And there's a massive moral hypocrisy at play here, right? I'm going to go over a few very specific examples instead of making a more generic point. The United Kingdom passed a law to send asylum seekers to Rwanda. This law was against the rules of European Union But thankfully, they had already had Brexit, right? So they claimed some exemption from European protections, even though they haven't fully disconnected themselves from the European judicial system, right? But at the same time, the UK also has domestic laws that require its compliance with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The UK is a signatory to the original Refugee Convention and to the 1967 Protocol. The UK is also a signatory to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But the UK also wants to force anybody that lands in the UK and seeks asylum to force them into Rwanda, a third country in Africa, which has seen lots of violence of its own, and which may just pick these people up and send them anywhere in the world for all they care. Right? Luckily, the High Court of the UK turned that law down because it violated asylum seekers' fundamental rights and put them in danger. It violated their right to no refoulement. Now, the government has moved another bill. And this time, in the new bill, they've restricted the court's powers to review it. So the moral hypocrisy there is glaring. It's out in your face. They want Bangladesh to treat Rohingya refugees a certain way. They want Pakistan to treat Afghan refugees a certain way. But they want to ship their own asylum seekers all the way out to Rwanda. And when the courts turn that down, they want to restrict the court's ability to review those laws. They've enacted new legislation that directs the courts to ignore certain elements of human rights law because they argue it does not apply to refugees or asylum seekers. Similarly, this is a poster from the Australian government. No way, you will not make Australia home. The Australian government has introduced the toughest border protection measures ever. If you get on a boat without a visa, you will not end up in Australia. Any vessel seeking to illegally enter Australia will be intercepted and saved. Then think of Ukraine, right? Russia invades Ukraine. Think of how the US went around lobbying the world for support and actually got offended when a bunch of countries didn't want to support them, right? But then that war also created a massive refugee crisis for Europe. Right? This may have been the biggest refugee crisis that the continent has faced since 1945. Syrians have been displaced from Syria for many years now, and Europe has taken a small number of Syrians. Europe has taken a small number of Afghans, but in Ukraine, you had a bunch of white Europeans who were now refugees, right? And then a small number of other groups who were Ukrainians or foreigners living in Ukraine who were also forced to become refugees, right? So now what happened? White people, and this is also recently why Germany now is one of the top refugee host countries, is because they've taken a bunch of white European refugees from Ukraine, right? But what happened is non-white people experienced racism and violence when they were trying to flee Ukraine, right? This picture, for example, is from the Time magazine. It shows Parvinder Singh, who's an Indian who was living in Ukraine, perhaps as a student, I'm not 100% sure, but he says he spent 3 days waiting to cross the border of Ukraine into Europe without food, water, or sleep, while white Ukrainians passed through much quickly. Black people, including Black Ukrainians, not even foreigners, including Black Ukrainians, were told to wait until after white families had passed and after white families and their pets had been processed. They were told they had capacity. So they were prioritizing dogs and cats before Black human beings. And this isn't 1930s, this is the 1920s, this isn't even 1940s. This is the 2020s, right? And this is the same global north that went around being offended because the rest of the world didn't see eye to eye on the conflict in Ukraine, right? But importantly, it's not just Europeans who are a little messed up when it comes to thinking about displaced people, right? Pakistan has hosted millions of Afghans for many years, but the conditions in which many of those people have lived have been pretty terrible. I'm going to conclude with this. I'm not going to give you any more specific details about how we have treated Afghans. I leave that to you to do your own research, to think about how you talk about Afghans among your